Study I'm presenting on is about an explosion that occurred on the USS Iowa on April 19th, 1989. The ship was first created in 1938 and served in both the Second World War and the Korean War before its retirement. 20 years later, in 1983, it was taken out of retirement and it was refurbished. However, because of its age, the ship still had a lot of issues, including hydraulic leaks, electrical issues, and many escape hatches were rusted shut. However, the biggest issue was that they never replaced the gunpowder on the ship, and because it was so old, it could ignite much more easily. Many of the Iowa's crew, including many senior staff, reported feeling unsafe while traveling on the vessel. Senior crew felt the growing pressure to make the USS Iowa a more effective battleship, having lost many war games against competing countries. They were made to conduct dangerous experiments aboard the Iowa that often violated safety standards. The experiment even involved the mixing of so-called supercharged powder to increase the force behind the ship's explosive shells. Even though people expressed concern that the gun's barrels would not be able to withstand the increased force from the supercharged powder, the crew were still made to use this power in test firing the ship's guns. This experiment did not result in death or injury. However, even senior members of the Iowa were reported to have discussed suicide due to the pressure to conduct these dangerous experiments. These experiments violated the Navy's safety standards. While preparing to test fire the guns on the day of the explosion, crew members monitoring the telephone calls in the gun's turrets heard someone yell that the gunpowder was smoldering. Moments later, the center gun of the second turret exploded. The fires caused by the initial explosion ignited gunpowder bags and caused additional explosions throughout the ship. In total, 47 people died and many others were injured from this event. All of the eyewitnesses were killed by the explosion, so determining its cause was a difficult task. The Navy employed a technique called equivocal death analysis to determine if the incident was caused by an accident, suicide, homicide, or a murder-suicide. In an equivocal death analysis, investigators use all available evidence of an incident, conduct interviews, and review records of the deceased. The investigation centered around second-class gunner Clayton Hartwig. In this case, the Navy conducted their own investigation in the beginning, but decided to call upon the FBI to conduct an additional investigation because they didn't feel their word alone would be trusted. The Navy's initial case theory was that the explosion was not an accident and that Clayton Hartwig had intentionally caused the explosion on the Iowa. The Navy apparently ruled out unstable gunpowder, electrical charges, and negligence of the crew. After FBI agents Alt and Hazelwood conducted their investigation, they concluded that the most likely scenario was that Hartwig had killed himself and the crew because, and I quote, "He was a loner, a man of low self-esteem who talked of dying in an explosion and being buried at Arlington Cemetery." However, Alt and Hazelwood were apparently told by the Navy from the very beginning that the explosion was not an accident and that the investigators were only to determine if it was intended to be a suicide, homicide, or both. Evidence in the FBI's report included a book with the title Getting Even, a military manual called the Improvised Munitions Handbook, and the fact that Hartwig had a long history of interest in explosives and weapons and had difficulty with relationships. Another key piece of information that was used in making a case against Hartwig was his close relationship with Petty Officer Kendall Truitt. Prior to the incident, the Navy investigated allegations that Hartwig and Truitt were gay, but the Navy found no evidence of this. After Truitt began dating a woman, their friendship wasn't as strong. But upon Hartwig's death, Truett was revealed as the beneficiary to a $100,000 life insurance policy. The investigators pointed to this speculative relationship as evidence that may have been depressed because of rejection by Truett, even though the allegations were unfounded. An additional piece of evidence was a poem that was found in one of the ship's guns with the words "Left to die alone" in a 16-inch gun. Investigators initially believed that Hartwig had written the poem. However, they would later discover that James White, another gunner's mate, had written it. Forensic analysts even proved the handwriting did not match Hartwig's. Regardless, it was still considered significant evidence to Hartwig's guilt. Hazelwood later testified that whether or not he had written the poem was immaterial, which made no sense because they were using it against him as significant evidence. There were quite a number of issues with regards to the conduct of the criminal justice system. Number one, the FBI relied heavily on the information provided by the Navy. However, when an outside agency is conducting an independent investigation, influence of their predecessors is supposed to be minimal. Also, higher officials highly scrutinized and micromanaged the investigation, which is against naval regulations and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Third, the FBI agents conducting the main investigation were apparently told from the very beginning that the explosion was not accidental. Like I said, when you're conducting an independent investigation, you're not supposed to be influenced by the other investigators, especially when it comes to case-breaking details like that. Fourth, the equivocal death analysis included a lot of evidence that was speculative. There was no proof that Hartwig was gay, and that any rejection took place that would have resulted in his committing suicide. Additionally, despite the fact that someone else wrote the poem found, the words of the poem were featured prominently throughout the equivocal death analysis. Also, possessing the book Improvised Munitions Handbook could have to do with the fact that they were being made to conduct dangerous experiments aboard the Iowa, many of which specifically involved explosive materials. Fifth, scientists from the Navy's laboratory also examined the evidence from the explosion and concluded that the results strongly pointed to an accidental cause of the explosion. Several independent psychologists generally agreed that Hartwig was not a suicidal murderer. Out of the 14 professionals who reviewed Alton Hazelwood's findings, 4 said that suicide was plausible. However, 10 of them rejected the findings. There was also a lot of criticism of equivocal death analysis as a technique. Considerable research shows them to be speculative in nature, and many suggest that they should not be used in legal settings. Finally, one of the biggest issues that I found was that the investigators neglected to acknowledge the dangerous experiments that the crew were being forced to conduct, and the possible role that played in the explosion that killed so many people. A possible way to improve upon the mistakes that were made in this case is to either stop using equivocal death analyses in legal cases altogether, or at least not rely heavily on the technique due to their speculative nature. Also, there should be some way for crew to report information anonymously when they feel uncomfortable with the situation, like many had felt during the dangerous experiments aboard the Iowa. Another possible improvement is to develop some way to prevent people in positions of authority from micromanaging a case when they're not supposed to. It is very possible that the Navy wanted to draw attention away from the fact that the crew of the USS Iowa were traveling on an unsafe vessel and were being forced to conduct dangerous experiments that may have resulted in the death of 47 people.